At Oro 6:17, on a cold February morning in 1943, long before the desert sun rose high enough to burn away the chill over the hills of northern Tunisia, a recovery team from the British 4th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment stood in stunned silence around the most feared war machine of the Second World War. The Germans had abandoned it only hours earlier during the fighting outside Jebel Jaffa. Its presence alone felt like an apparition. 57 tons of steel, nearly 4 meters tall, with armor plates so thick they seemed carved from the side of a cliff. A Tiger tank, the myth itself. Soldiers who had faced it in battle described their shells bouncing off its hull as if hitting a stone wall. Reports from the front lines repeated the same phrase again and again. Nothing in the British arsenal could kill one head on. Even seasoned tank commanders, men who had survived North Africa since 1940, approached the immobilized giant with caution. They circled it, studying the thick glasses, the intimidating 88mm gun, the crude but imposing engineering. Technically, it was just steel. Emotionally, it was a monster. A war correspondent embedded with the regiment noted in his field journal that morning, "The men look at it like some living thing that simply stopped breathing." The turret was locked in place, the tracks damaged, but the hull remained intact, still radiating a sense of invincibility. Tiger 131, later displayed at Bovington, was the first operational Tiger ever captured intact by the Allies. To British command it was a miracle. To German high command it was a catastrophe. But to one person who arrived hours later, stepping out of a canvas-covered Bedford truck with a satchel of instruments and a quiet, unassuming demeanor, the tank was not a monster at all. It was a question waiting to be solved. She was a metallurgist from the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, assigned to the Woolwich Arsenal Metallurgy Division. Her name remains absent from most public histories, partly because her work was technical, partly because wartime reports rarely highlighted civilian specialists, and partly because her findings were classified for years. But her colleagues in the DSIR later wrote that she possessed an unusual clarity. When looking at steel, she did not see plates and armor. She saw failures, impurities, stress paths, and the hidden stories inside metal grains. She arrived without ceremony, acknowledged the officers gathered near the captured tank, and walked directly toward the left side armor, her boots sinking slightly into the Tunisian sand, scorched by days of fighting. She paused in front of a thin, jagged line running outward from a shallow impact mark. The soldiers around her believed it was just shrapnel damage, but she knelt, touched the rough edge with her gloved fingers, and studied it silently. To her, the crack was wrong. Armor that thick should deform under pressure, not fracture. It should dent, bend, resist. Instead, here was a break-sharp crystalline brittle, something armor of this reputation should never display. She stood up slowly, her expression calm but focused, and spoke a sentence that made several officers turn their heads. "Armor does not fail like this," she said. "Not unless the steel is wrong from the start." It was a moment few expected. The Tiger's legend had grown so quickly and so violently on the battlefield that many believed its armor to be beyond ordinary analysis. But she did not believe in legends. She believed in microstructure, carbon distribution, alloy balance, and heat treatment. And the more she looked, the more inconsistencies she saw. A second crack near the front plate. A strange texture pattern around the hull, weld joints. Signs that the tank's strength might not lie in its thickness, but in its weaknesses, buried deep inside the metal itself. Officers discussed anti-tank performance impact angles, ricochet probabilities. She listened politely, then asked for permission to take samples. When granted, she marked several extraction points, already knowing that the truth of the Tiger's armor would not be found on the battlefield, but under a microscope hundreds of miles away. A corporal asked whether she expected to find a new alloy or some breakthrough German formula. She shook her head. If this tank failed, she replied, it failed because it was built too quickly or with too little of what it needed. Either way, the story is inside the steel. In that moment, the invincible facade of the Tiger began to fracture in more ways than one. While soldiers saw a machine built to dominate every engagement it entered, she saw evidence that the real war was not only fought with shells and gunfire, but with furnaces or quality alloy shortages and rushed industrial decisions. Every tank was born long before it reached the battlefield. Its fate was sealed in the foundries. The camera of history often lingers on dramatic duels between armor and firepower explosions and collapsing turrets. But the real drama that morning was quiet, a woman in a dusty field coat running her hand along a crack in a myth. Her presence alone shifted the narrative. Until then, the Allies believed they were losing because their weapons were weaker. She suspected the truth was far more complicated, that Germany's strongest weapon might be hiding a vulnerability no commander had anticipated. As the team prepared Tiger 131 for transport, she continued documenting every irregularity she could find. The tank would be sent to Britain for full mechanical testing. Her samples would go to the metallurgical laboratory first. The officers assumed the tank's armor would reveal a superalloy, some secret formula explaining its resilience. She left with a different hypothesis, forming in her mind perhaps the Tiger was not strong because Germany had mastered metallurgy. Perhaps it was strong simply because it was thick, and thickness alone could not hide the flaws introduced by a nation running out of critical resources. In the weeks ahead, her observations would spark a revelation that rewrote Allied anti-armor doctrine. But on that morning in Tunisia, all of it began with a single line of fractured steel, a question asked quietly in the desert air, and a woman willing to challenge the myth everyone else accepted. If you believe that even an invincible machine can hide a fatal flaw, comment the number 7. If you disagree, leave a like. And before we move on to the next part of the investigation, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss how this story unfolds. In the months leading up to the appearance of Tiger 131 on the battlefield, British intelligence analysts had been receiving scattered reports that hinted at something unusual in the German armored program. Throughout 1942, captured fragments from Panzer III and I-4 hulls revealed increasingly inconsistent metallurgical quality. Some plates registered hardness values far below earlier models, while others showed erratic carbon distribution that made them prone to sudden cracking under stress. At first, the War Office assumed these irregularities were the byproduct of hurried factory output. But as German heavy armor began to appear in North Africa, first sporadically, then in growing numbers, those inconsistencies took on a new meaning. German industry was producing breakthrough machines, but the alloy composition inside them was changing in ways that suggested deep industrial strain. To understand how the Tiger was born, one must look back to the summer of 1941, when the Wehrmacht first encountered the Soviet T-34 and KV-1. The shock was immediate. German shells ricocheted off sloped armor they had never anticipated, and Colonel General Guderian demanded a response that bordered on impossible. Hitler himself issued the directive Germany would build a tank no enemy could destroy. It was more than a military order. It was a psychological mandate. The new tank had to be a symbol of dominance, a machine that restored the aura of inevitability around German victories. Engineers at Henschel, responsible for the Tiger's design, faced pressures that stretched beyond engineering discipline. The Führer wanted results, and he wanted them fast. But engineering ambition is only as strong as the industrial backbone beneath it. Germany's access to critical alloying elements, molybdenum, nickel, chromium, had already been strained by the British naval blockade and the loss of overseas suppliers. Molybdenum, essential for strengthening steel at high temperatures and preventing brittleness, had been sourced heavily from mines in the United States and South America before the war. By 1942, those supply lines were gone. Nickel, crucial for armor toughness, was also dwindling. Chromium supplies, partially dependent on the Balkans, were increasingly unreliable due to partisan disruptions. German metallurgists were forced to substitute dilute, and stretch what little alloying material they had across far more industrial demands than their pre-war projections ever imagined. Against this backdrop, the Tiger became both a triumph and a burden. Its 100mm armor plate was impressive on paper, but it required enormous quantities of high-quality steel, and the furnaces producing it were under relentless pressure. German metallurgical directives from late 1942 reveal attempts to standardize armor production with reduced alloy content, compensating through quenching procedures that demanded precision most factories could not maintain consistently. Small deviations in cooling time, carbon content, or heat exposure created microscopic flaws, imperfections invisible to the naked eye but catastrophic under battlefield stress. Wartime propaganda celebrated the Tiger as a masterpiece of engineering, but in truth, it was also a product of shortcuts forced by circumstance. While Germany wrestled with these industrial constraints, Britain had been building something else entirely, a scientific intelligence machine designed not to outproduce Germany, but to outthink it. After the fall of France, the British government expanded the role of the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, tasking it with analyzing all recovered enemy equipment. Every bullet fragment, every armor plate, every mechanical component brought back from the front lines was examined in laboratories at Woolwich Arsenal, Farnborough, and the Royal Aircraft Establishment. The Allies lacked the industrial scale of German wartime production, but they compensated by developing what internal memos called forensic warfare, a method of studying enemy equipment with the same rigor scientists applied to solving complex research problems. Within this ecosystem, the metallurgist who examined Tiger 131 was not an anomaly. She was part of a growing cadre of scientific specialists recruited for their ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. Many were civilians with academic backgrounds in chemistry, physics, materials science, and metallurgy. Some had worked in industry before the war, while others came from research institutions across Britain. Their work rarely reached newspapers, but their influence extended directly into tactical and strategic decisions. When a British tank unit complained that their shells bounced off German armor, it was these scientists who investigated why. When the Royal Navy recovered fragments from U-boats sunk in the Atlantic, it was materials analysts who examined the alloys for weaknesses. When the RAF needed to understand the structural properties of German aircraft wings, it was metallurgists who studied the aluminum and magnesium alloys that held them together. The woman who examined Tiger 131 belonged to this quiet army of scientific investigators. Her peers described her as methodical, patient, and relentlessly curious. She approached enemy machines not with awe or anger, but with a calm desire to understand how they worked and, more importantly, how they could be defeated. The DSIR assigned her to armor analysis due to her expertise in heat treatment processes, grain structure evaluation, and failure analysis. In the years before the war, she had worked on industrial research related to heavy machinery. Now that knowledge became a strategic asset. The Tiger, however, represented a different kind of challenge. It was not simply thicker armor, it was a statement of confidence from the German war machine. British tank crews feared it, German tank crews revered it, and Allied intelligence analysts feared that if this monster could be mass-produced, it might shift the balance of armored warfare entirely. The DSIR understood that defeating such a machine required more than better guns. It required understanding the metal itself, the industrial constraints behind it, and the compromises hidden within its construction. When she first submitted a preliminary report on the armor plate irregularities and requested further laboratory testing, some senior officers doubted that metallurgy could reveal anything battlefield commanders hadn't already learned through combat experience. But those doubts faded as more fragments and captured components arrived from Tunisia. She compared samples from Tiger 131 with pieces recovered from earlier Panzer models and found patterns decreasing molybdenum content, coarser grain structures, and inconsistent quench depths. These were not battlefield anomalies. They were systemic issues. They told a story of an industrial giant stretched to its breaking point. Germany could build Tigers. What it could not do was build them perfectly. As she prepared to begin full laboratory testing, she understood the stakes. If she was correct, the Tiger's legendary invincibility was not a product of superior materials, but an illusion created by sheer mass and aggressive wartime myth-making. The real advantage for the Allies was not a stronger gun, it was insight. If you believe that understanding the industry behind a weapon is as important as understanding the weapon itself. Comment the number 7. If you disagree, leave a like. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter where laboratory analysis starts revealing the Tiger's hidden flaws. Begins the moment the samples taken from Tiger 131, the fearsome machine captured under the Tunisian sun, arrived at the Metallurgy Division in Woolwich Arsenal. The crates were marked for priority handling, a classification normally reserved for aircraft wreckage or naval armor. Inside the laboratory, the atmosphere felt less like a workshop and more like an operating theater preparing for a high-risk procedure. Technicians laid out the steel cuttings, fragments, and weld sections across a long bench under white clinical lighting. Each piece bore a handwritten label noting its origin: glacis plate, mantlet edge, hull side turret face weld seam. The woman who had first examined the tank in Tunisia stood quietly beside the table, observing without ceremony. She had waited weeks for this moment, knowing that only here, under magnification, under heat, under stress, would the steel surrender its secrets. The first step was non-destructive testing. The team measured hardness using Brunel and Vickers scales, expecting the Tiger's armor to register numbers consistent with high-quality, face-hardened steel. Instead, results fluctuated dramatically across samples. One section of the upper hull displayed hardness values appropriate for well-tempered armor. The adjacent sample, taken only centimeters away, recorded readings so low they resembled mild steel. This inconsistency was alarming. Armor plate of this size should have uniform hardness across its surface. The discrepancy suggested uneven heat treatment, an indication of rushed production or furnace overload. As the technicians completed the hardness map, results formed an irregular mosaic rather than a predictable gradient. The metallurgist studied the chart expression tightening. Steel that behaved unpredictably was dangerous to both builder and operator. Next came microscopic analysis. The laboratory prepared metallographic slides by polishing and etching small steel sections with acid, revealing grain structure beneath the surface. Under the microscope, the truth emerged with startling clarity. Instead of fine martensitic grains, the hallmark of properly quenched armor, the samples showed coarse needle-like formations. Some areas displayed bainite mixed with pearlite, indicating the steel had cooled too slowly during the quenching process. In other words, the armor had not hardened uniformly. Worse still, several slides displayed a mottled constellation of dark inclusions, sulfides, oxides, and slag impurities trapped during forging. This was not the steel of a nation at its industrial peak. This was steel of a nation under siege, steel pulled from smelters working beyond capacity, steel starved of high-quality alloying materials, steel forged by workers racing against deadlines dictated not by engineering standards, but by battlefield desperation. She recorded everything with meticulous detail. The inclusions were larger than expected, suggesting insufficient refining of the molten metal. The coarse grain structure indicated overheating during forging. The inconsistent hardness revealed the furnace's inability to handle plates of such massive thickness. Collectively, the data painted a picture more damning than any Allied tank commander could have imagined. The Tiger was not a flawless masterpiece. It was a compromise. Chemical composition analysis was next. Using spectroscopy, the team measured alloy content across several points. The results confirmed her earlier suspicions. Molybdenum, vital for high-temperature strength and toughness, appeared in reduced quantities compared to pre-1942 German armor samples. Nickel content essential for preventing brittle fractures was sharply lower than historical benchmarks. Chromium levels showed significant variation, a sign that Germany's access to high-grade ore had deteriorated with the tightening Allied blockade. Every missing element told a story. Molybdenum mines lost, nickel stocks diverted to U-boat production, chromium shipments disrupted by sabotage and partisan raids across the Balkans. Each shortage forced Germany to stretch its alloy supply thinner, and the Tiger heavy and demanding required enormous quantities of these elements to achieve the reputation propaganda had built for it. When the Metallurgist compared her findings with intelligence reports on German industrial strain, a chilling narrative emerged. Germany had attempted to build an invincible machine while lacking the materials required for invincibility. The Tiger's armor depended not on advanced metallurgy, but on thickness alone. Its myth survived because most Allied weapons struggled to penetrate that thickness. But steel, like any material, has rules. If the alloy mix is compromised and the heat treatment is inconsistent, the resulting plate may look formidable but behave unpredictably under stress. Her team moved on to destructive testing. They subjected the samples to tensile stress, bending stress, and impact loading. Under a Charpy impact test, a standard method of measuring a material's toughness, the Tiger samples performed far worse than earlier German armor. At low temperatures, several specimens fractured cleanly, revealing a crystalline surface that glittered under laboratory lights. Brittle fracture. The very failure mode she had first suspected the moment she touched the damaged hull in Tunisia. In combat conditions, especially in cold environments like the Eastern Front, this behavior was catastrophic. An armor plate could hold against repeated impacts, then suddenly split open under a relatively minor strike. A tank that relied on its armor as its primary defense could not afford such unpredictability. The results were undeniable. The Tiger's fatal weakness was not visible from the outside. It was hidden inside the steel itself, buried in its microstructure, encoded in its very birth during forging and quenching. Her report stated plainly that Germany's industrial limitations had created armor that was strong in theory but unreliable in practice. She concluded that the Tiger's true power lay in psychology. Thick plates, frightening silhouette, terrifying gun. But its armor, its defining feature, was vulnerable, not because it lacked thickness, but because it lacked the metallurgical quality required to support that thickness. The War Office convened a special briefing to review the findings. Officers who had once viewed the Tiger as a near supernatural weapon now listened with sharpened attention. The briefing room, normally filled with tactical discussions, now hosted diagrams of grain boundaries, charts of alloy content, and photographs of brittle fracture surfaces. She presented the evidence with calm precision. Her findings overturned assumptions held at every level of command. The Tiger could be defeated not by matching its mass, but by exploiting its metallurgical flaws. This insight did not simply influence anti-tank doctrine, it reshaped Allied engineering strategy. Laboratory testing continued for weeks. The team compared the Tiger samples with Allied steel from Churchill's Shermans and Crusader tanks. While British and American armor was thinner, it was often tougher and more consistent. The comparison stunned some officers. The Allies had armor of lesser thickness, but superior metallurgical reliability, meaning their tanks could survive hits that a Tiger's poorly treated steel might not withstand. The myth of German superiority cracked under the weight of scientific evidence. By early spring 1943, her full report, now classified, circulated through key departments. It explained not only how the Tiger's armor failed, but why Germany's heavy tanks would continue to suffer from similar problems as the war progressed. The Tiger was too big for Germany's strained industrial base. Its demands exceeded what the Reich's compromised metallurgy could reliably deliver. What commanders had interpreted as invincibility was largely the result of battlefield angles, psychological shock, and Allied weapons still adapting to new threats. Her analysis shattered the legend, and once a myth breaks, it cannot be repaired. If you believe that science can dismantle even the strongest legend, comment the number 7. If you disagree, leave a like. And subscribe so you won't miss Part 4, where we reveal how her findings transformed Allied weapons development and shaped the downfall of Germany's heavy armor. Opened inside a windowless conference room in the War Office, a space normally reserved for high-level operational planning. But this time, the long oak table was covered not with maps of Europe or troop disposition charts, but with metallographic slides, fracture photographs, hardness graphs, and spectrographic readouts. The room was filled with men whose world revolved around armor-piercing shells, battlefield tactics, and armored doctrine. Yet, on this day, they found themselves listening to the quiet, analytical voice of a metallurgist whose discoveries challenged everything they thought they knew about the Tiger tank. Her report was not simply a scientific document. It was a strategic weapon. The presentation began with a stark image projected on the far wall, a brittle fracture surface from Tiger 131 glittering in a jagged crystalline pattern. The officers leaned forward, many recognizing at once what the image implied. Steel that fractured this way lacked internal toughness. It behaved unpredictably, especially in combat conditions. She explained calmly that this failure mode was consistent with low molybdenum content, erratic quenching, and coarse grain growth caused by overheated armor plates during forging. These defects were not isolated flaws. They were systemic across the Tiger samples. She showed hardness maps demonstrating sections of armor that shifted from hardened steel to almost untreated mild steel in the span of centimeters. The officers exchanged silent glances. They were not accustomed to hearing that the most feared machine on the battlefield was at its core held together by compromised metal. What mattered most, however, were the implications. She explained that the Tiger's massive thickness created an illusion of invulnerability. Allied shells failed to penetrate not because the armor was superior, but because the shells were too light or struck at angles that neutralized their full energy. In other words, the Tiger's survival was statistical, not metallurgical. If the Allies could create impacts that exploited the armor's brittle zones, especially at lower temperatures or near weld seams, the tank would not endure the punishment German propaganda claimed it could. The head of anti-tank weapons development, a brigadier with years of combat experience in North Africa, asked the question on every commander's mind. "Where is it weakest?" she answered, with forensic clarity, anywhere the armor plate was too thick to cool uniformly. The thicker the section, the more difficulty German factories had, producing even quenching. As a result, areas near welds, joints, transition zones, and massive plates were far more brittle. The Tiger's greatest selling point, its sheer mass, was also its greatest flaw. "If we strike it here or here," she said, pointing to diagrams of the mantlet edge and lower glacis joint, the chances of brittle fracture increased significantly. Silence followed, broken only by the rustle of documents. Then the room shifted into action. Officers from artillery, tank gunnery, and research began discussing ways to adapt Allied weapons to exploit these weaknesses. What she presented was not just technical detail, it was tactical opportunity. Her findings ignited a chain reaction across multiple departments. Within days, a directive went out to Allied anti-tank research teams: prioritize impact force, not penetration depth. If brittle failure could be induced, a shell that might not traditionally penetrate could still produce catastrophic cracking. This insight influenced the design philosophy of Britain's next-generation anti-tank munitions. High-velocity, solid-shot, improved tungsten core penetrators and shaped charge refinements suddenly gained new importance. The question shifted from how do we pierce the Tiger to how do we break it. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence analysts updated their threat assessments. The Tiger remained dangerous, No laboratory report could change the brutal reality of its 88mm gun or its battlefield presence, but it was no longer considered untouchable. Commanders were instructed to distribute knowledge of the tank's vulnerabilities to field units. Training manuals began to emphasize flank angles, weld seam targeting, and the science of inducing shock loading. Tank crews in Britain and the United States studied her diagrams during briefings. Infantry anti-tank teams were taught to aim for known structurally inconsistent zones. Her findings also traveled farther than the battlefield. They reached strategic planners concerned with Germany's long-term industrial capacity. For years, Allied leaders had assumed that German heavy armor represented a manufacturing advantage. But her analysis told another story. Germany was pushing its factories to produce tanks beyond the limits of their metallurgical supply chain. This meant the German war machine was straining itself from the inside. Heavy tanks required immense quantities of alloyed steel, and every Tiger rolled out of a factory consumed more of the resources Germany was rapidly losing. Intelligence analysts at Bletchley and the Ministry of Economic Warfare realized that one Tiger cost Germany far more materially and industrially than it could ever repay in battlefield performance. Her research contributed to a broader strategic conclusion: German heavy armor was an economic liability disguised as a battlefield asset. By the summer of 1943, her insights began shaping Allied decisions at the highest levels. One internal memorandum stated bluntly, "German heavy tank production is metallurgically unsustainable." Another document circulated among planners at the Ministry of Supply declared the Tiger vulnerable by nature, not by accident. These were not rhetorical statements. They influenced procurement decisions, tank development priorities, and long-term expectations of German armored strength. Field reports soon validated the laboratory findings. On the Eastern Front, Soviet engineers examining captured Tigers noticed similar brittle fractures and inconsistent armor quality. Their observations aligned with her conclusions almost exactly. In Italy, British tank commanders reported that when Tigers were struck on the turret edges or lower glacis cracks, sometimes spread far wider than expected. One Churchill commander described a Tiger knocked out not by full penetration, but by a fracture that split the weld seam. Her findings had predicted such behavior before any field unit had documented it. The science was proving itself in combat. Yet the most significant transformation occurred within the mindset of Allied forces. Fear of the Tiger began to erode, not because the tank was less deadly, but because knowledge replaced myth. Before her analysis, many soldiers viewed the Tiger as an unstoppable juggernaut. After her findings reached the front, the Tiger became what it truly was: a machine with limits, flaws, and vulnerabilities, some visible, some buried deep in its steel. The psychological shift was immediate. Battles that once ended in panic now ended in methodical countermeasures. And every time a Tiger was destroyed by exploiting its metallurgical weaknesses, the legend weakened further. In the War Office, the Metallurgist remained largely anonymous, her work buried under classification markings. But those who understood the significance of her research recognized that she had done something no shell or gun had managed to do. She had broken the Tiger before it ever reached the battlefield. By revealing the truth inside its armor, she had given the Allies a weapon more powerful than raw firepower certainty. If you believe that knowledge can be as decisive as any weapon, comment the number 7. If you disagree, leave a like. And before we move on to Part 5, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss how her discovery reshaped the rest of the war and why German heavy tanks never recovered from the flaw she exposed. In the months that followed the revelation of the Tiger's metallurgical flaws, the British scientific intelligence apparatus evolved into something unprecedented. A war machine powered not by steel and explosives, but by microscopes, spectrographs, and the relentless curiosity of researchers who understood that every enemy weapon contained a hidden autobiography. The metallurgist, who had dismantled the Tiger's myth from the inside, now found herself at the center of a rapidly expanding effort. Captured German material from armor plates, to crankshafts from aircraft wing panels, to U-boat hull fragments flowed into the DSIR's laboratories like a river of wounded machines waiting to confess their secrets. She did not seek attention, nor did she receive much beyond internal acknowledgments. Yet her name circulated quietly among departments that mattered: weapons development, tank design, intelligence, evaluation, and even the Ministry of Economic Warfare. Her findings had exposed something deeper than structural weaknesses. They revealed the internal contradictions of the German war economy, contradictions that would only widen as the Allied blockade tightened and the Reich's access to alloying elements collapsed. One of the first areas to change was British tank design. Engineers at Vickers Armstrong and Leyland Motors now worked under a new guiding principle: consistency beats mass. Where Germany produced fewer, heavier tanks with questionable steel quality, British and American factories focused on reliable alloys, repeatable heat treatments, and scalable manufacturing. The Churchill Mk7 began receiving armor plates treated with stricter quenching protocols that delivered uniform grain structures across the entire surface. The engineers understood the lesson clearly. Victory did not require matching the Tiger's size. It required guaranteeing the armor would behave predictably under fire. Her research had already demonstrated that predictability was a tactical advantage. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun, originally viewed as an overpowered weapon, searching for a justification, suddenly became a strategic priority. Her work made the case obvious. If brittle fracture could be induced through high kinetic impact, then the answer was not thicker armor on Allied tanks, it was higher velocity rounds with improved penetrator design. Metallurgists and gunnery experts collaborated to refine tungsten core APDS prototypes. The first trials conducted at Shoeburyness produced results that mirrored her predictions on thick but poorly quenched German armor. The impact caused large-scale fracturing along heat-stressed boundaries. What years of tank combat had failed to accomplish, metallurgy achieved in seconds. She reviewed the first test films with the same careful attention she had given to Tiger 131's flawed plates. Slow-motion footage showed the moment of impact, a brilliant flash of steel dust, followed by a spiderweb of cracks racing across the plate. She didn't smile, but she tapped the screen lightly with her pen, marking the exact point of brittle failure. The officers around her understood what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a shell test. This was the collapse of a legend. Elsewhere, the Ministry of Economic Warfare began using her metallurgical assessments to predict German production bottlenecks. When spectrographic analysis showed decreasing chromium content in late 1943 armor samples, analysts correlated it with intercepted intelligence about transport disruptions in the Balkans. When nickel levels dropped further in early 1944, samples economists inferred that Germany was sacrificing armor quality to maintain aircraft engine production. Every shortage she documented became a strategic indicator. Her reports, originally filed as technical notes, evolved into forecasts used in high-level policy meetings. Even the RAF took interest. When fragments from downed FW-190 and Me-109 fighters arrived at DSIR facilities, she expanded her research to include lightweight alloys. Tests revealed inconsistent magnesium-aluminum combinations, telltale signs of rushed casting, insufficient heat treatment, and the growing scarcity of high-grade bauxite. Aircraft wings designed for precision flight were becoming vulnerable to structural fatigue long before they reached their operational limits. Her findings were forwarded to RAF planners. German aircraft may appear formidable, but their lifespan was shortening under the pressure of compromised materials. One of the most striking consequences of her work emerged on the Eastern Front. Soviet metallurgists, already aware of inconsistencies in German armor, received fragments analyzed jointly by Allied intelligence. Their own findings mirrored hers with remarkable accuracy. For the first time in the war, British, American, and Soviet laboratories aligned around a shared conclusion: German heavy armor was unsustainable. It could dominate a single duel, but it could not win a long war against nations capable of producing tougher, more reliable steel in far greater quantities. The psychological impact of these discoveries cannot be overstated. By mid-1944, the Allied front lines were filled with tank crews and infantrymen who no longer viewed the Tiger as invincible. It was still dangerous, deadly even, but its aura of inevitability had evaporated. Commanders briefed their units with diagrams derived directly from her analysis weld: seams, mantlet, edges, turret ring, housings, transition plates, cold weather crack risk zones. The myth shrank into something manageable, finite, beatable. But her influence reached beyond tactics and weapons. It reshaped the narrative of modern warfare itself. Before her work, the enemy's strength was measured in armor thickness, gun caliber, and battlefield performance. After her work, strength was measured in alloy, content, grain uniformity, industrial consistency, and supply chain resilience. She taught the Allied command that war was not decided only on the front lines. It was decided in foundries, factories, and metallurgical laboratories long before the first shell was fired. Her colleagues said she possessed a rare gift: the ability to see the connection between microscopic imperfections and world-scale consequences. She never exaggerated her findings, never dramatized the results, but her reports carried a gravity that no general could ignore. When she wrote that the armor plate exhibits catastrophic failure under low-temperature impact, commanders did not read it as a laboratory phrase. They read it as a tactical warning: a Tiger in winter may die to a shot that would not threaten it in summer. The war moved on. Germany rolled out heavier machines: Tiger II, Jagdtiger, Ferdinand. Yet each of them, despite their intimidating forms, suffered from the same inherited flaw: steel that could not reach the performance its thickness demanded. Her team analyzed every captured fragment. The story never changed: bigger tanks, weaker metallurgy. By early 1945, the consequences were visible everywhere, from shattered Tiger IIs lying cracked open on the Ardennes roads to immobilized Jagdtigers whose armor split cleanly after glancing impacts. The legend was not destroyed by firepower alone. The legend collapsed under the weight of its own flawed steel. And she, a civilian metallurgist at a quiet laboratory in Woolwich, had been the first to see it. If you believe that the smallest flaw can decide the fate of the largest machine, comment the number 7. If you disagree, leave a like. And make sure to subscribe before you go. The final chapters reveal how her discoveries shaped post-war engineering and why the world's tank designs still echo the lessons she uncovered. In the years immediately after the war, when victory parades faded and headlines shifted to reconstruction, most histories focused on generals, tank aces, and grand strategies. What rarely appeared in newspapers but shaped the post-war world just as profoundly were the quiet revolutions born inside laboratories like the one at Woolwich. Her discoveries about German armor did not end with the fall of Berlin. They became the foundation of a new scientific doctrine that engineering triumphs and engineering failures determine the fate of nations long before soldiers reach the battlefield. And in 1946, as Allied nations began dismantling the machinery of war to understand what had gone right and what had nearly gone disastrously wrong, she found herself once again standing over fragments of steel, not to defeat an enemy this time, but to ensure the next war would never be fought with illusions instead of knowledge. The first major post-war conference on armored warfare materials convened in London that spring. Representatives from Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, and even a small delegation from France gathered to examine the captured German and Soviet vehicles shipped to proving grounds across the United Kingdom. The Tiger 131, now carefully restored for mechanical testing, sat as the centerpiece. The delegates admired its imposing presence, but it was she standing beside a large metallurgical display who explained why the tank's history could not be separated from its flaws. She began with the same crystalline fracture surface she had projected during her wartime briefing. Only this time her audience was not military officers desperate for a tactical edge, but engineers, designers, and metallurgists intent on understanding how a superweapon had collapsed under the weight of its own metallurgy. She guided them through the same microscopic landscapes she had documented during the war: coarse-grained slag inclusions, uneven tempering alloy deficiencies. But now the implication was broader. This, she explained, is what happens when an advanced design exceeds the limits of the industrial base required to produce it. Her statement became one of the guiding principles of post-war tank design worldwide. In the years that followed, British engineers applied her findings directly to the development of the Centurion tank, a vehicle that would become one of the most successful armored designs of the 20th century. Rather than chasing extreme thickness like the Tiger, the Centurion prioritized high-quality rolled homogeneous armor, consistent, predictable, resilient. Its designers studied her reports on brittle failure with the same attention they gave to gunnery tests. Every decision about alloy composition, heat treatment, and structural layout reflected the lessons she had extracted from the Tiger's corpse. The Centurion's toughness in Korea and the Middle East would later be cited as proof that metallurgy, not mass alone, decides survivability. Across the Atlantic, American engineers also took note. The post-war M46 and M47 patent series incorporated refinements in armor quality inspired by wartime metallurgical analysis. U.S. metallurgists adopted stricter quenching protocols and new alloy standards, echoing the DSIR's insistence that steel be engineered, not merely forged. Reports circulated among U.S. research laboratories referencing British findings, often without naming her directly, emphasizing that no tank, regardless of its size or theoretical strength, could perform reliably unless its material quality matched its design. But the influence of her work extended far beyond tanks. In aviation, her assessment of late-war German magnesium-aluminum alloys became a cornerstone of Allied research into fatigue resistance. When post-war aircraft designers sought lightweight materials for jet fighters and bombers, they returned to the DSIR reports that had documented structural inconsistencies in the wings of downed FW-190s. Her conclusions helped prevent the adoption of brittle alloy combinations that would have posed catastrophic risks in high-speed flight. Naval engineers learned similar lessons. The captured hull fragments of U-boats many analyzed under her supervision revealed the metallurgical shortcuts Germany had taken as the war dragged on. This knowledge informed post-war submarine design, particularly in the development of high-toughness steels capable of withstanding deep-water pressure cycles without cracking. The first generation of Cold War submarines, British, American, and eventually Soviet, were shaped by the metallurgical principles she had articulated. Yet the greatest influence of her work was philosophical. She had demonstrated that the myths of war, invincible armor, unstoppable tanks, superior enemy engineering could be dismantled with microscopes and hard data. She had shown that weapons were not symbols or legends. They were material artifacts whose performance reflected resource availability, industrial capacity, and scientific rigor. Her colleagues in the DSIR would later say that she had taught the military to think like scientists and taught scientists to think like strategists. But for all her achievements, she remained largely anonymous to the public. The documents detailing her contributions remained classified until the late 1950s, and even then wartime metallurgical teams were rarely credited by name. Her reports circulated widely among engineers and defense researchers, but her signature at the bottom of each page was often replaced with departmental titles or reference numbers. She did not protest. She had never sought recognition, only accuracy. Still, among those who knew her work firsthand, she earned a quiet reputation. She saw through steel, one colleague later remarked. Where others saw armor plate, She saw a story about supply lines shortages and the stresses of an overextended empire. Another engineer described her as the scientist who broke the tiger, though she always dismissed such phrases as dramatic nonsense. She insisted she had simply observed what the evidence made undeniable. By the early 1950s, she had transitioned into a senior advisory role, mentoring new metallurgists entering post-war research institutions. Many of them were young men who had never experienced battle, but were tasked with shaping the materials that would define the next generation of military and civilian technologies. She taught them the importance of understanding a material's life cycle, from ore to foundry to battlefield failure. She encouraged them to look beyond specifications and ask how economic pressure, political decisions, and industrial constraints shaped engineering outcomes. One of her most important lessons came from her wartime notebooks, which she occasionally allowed students to study under strict supervision. The pages contained meticulous drawings of fracture surfaces, hardness diagrams, and alloy charts, but also quiet observations about human behavior, notes about factory workers in Essen working under air raid sirens, questions about how overworked metallurgists in occupied territories managed with dwindling resources, comments on how desperation forced creativity and how fear produced shortcuts that became deadly flaws years later. She understood that metallurgy was never isolated from the world around it. It absorbed everything: stress, scarcity, ambition, failure. Her wartime discovery that the Tiger's armor had failed long before its first battle became a metaphor she often repeated during lectures. "A machine begins to die the moment it is built incorrectly," she said. "Steel remembers every step of its making." By the late 1960s, when global tensions shifted into the Cold War arms race, her insights shaped not only the tanks of NATO, but the policies governing resource allocation and strategic manufacturing. Defense ministries consulted her analyses when deciding which alloys to prioritize, which supply chains to protect, which factories to modernize, and which engineering programs required oversight. Not because she sought influence, but because her wartime work had proven a simple truth: the quality of a nation's steel is the quality of its survival. She retired quietly without ceremony, her wartime role known only to a circle of specialists who preserved her findings like a historical treasure. But decades later, when Tiger 131 was restored at the Bovington Tank Museum and displayed as a perfectly preserved artifact, visitors marveled at its size, its lines, its terrifying gun. They rarely noticed the small cracks preserved in the armor carefully documented during restoration work. They did not know that those cracks had once altered the course of engineering history. But she would have noticed, and she would have understood what they meant. If you believe that understanding the past requires looking beneath the surface, comment the number 7. If you disagree, leave a like. And before we continue to the final chapter, remember to subscribe. You won't want to miss how her forgotten legacy shaped the science of modern warfare long after the guns of 1945 fell silent. In the decades that followed her retirement, the world changed faster than any military historian of 1945 could have imagined. Nations split and realigned. Missiles replaced artillery as the currency of power, and armored divisions gave way to proxy conflicts and nuclear doctrines. Yet even as technology leapt forward, the fundamental lesson she had uncovered inside the fractured steel of Tiger 131 remained. Engineers, commanders, and policymakers kept returning to the same truth she had articulated in her wartime reports: no weapon, no matter how imposing, is stronger than the industrial and scientific discipline that forged it. And no myth survives when examined under the lens of metallurgy. Her notebooks, worn ink-faded and filled with diagrams that blended scientific precision with a strange kind of quiet humanity, became a secret inheritance for generations of researchers who followed in her footsteps. They passed from hand to hand, classroom to laboratory war college to manufacturing plant. On the inside cover of one notebook was a line she had written sometime late in 1943 during an air raid when the lights flickered and dust drifted down from the rafters. Steel carries the memory of its making. And history remembers those who read that memory correctly. For years that line was quoted in lectures, cited in technical manuals, even printed on the walls of some metallurgical institutes, though few knew the woman behind the words. By the 1970s, her influence had quietly crossed borders. Engineers in Sweden studying cold weather fracture resistance drew upon her analysis of brittle failure. Japanese researchers developing high-toughness steels for shipbuilding cited her observations on grain refinement. Soviet metallurgists newly accessing declassified British wartime documents recognized her analytical fingerprints in the reports they had only heard whispers about during the Cold War. In a strange twist of history, her work helped shape some of the very technologies designed to counter the weapons she had once analyzed. Meanwhile, military museums gained popularity, becoming places where visitors could touch the past rather than simply read about it. At Bovington, Tiger 131 became not only a tourist attraction, but a historical beacon. Researchers restored the tank meticulously, preserving weld seams, armor scars, and manufacturing marks that spoke of Germany's industrial struggle. During the restoration, engineers uncovered structural clues that matched her wartime reports perfectly: grain coarsening, quench cracks, and alloy inconsistencies that had been invisible to all but a handful of trained eyes in 1943. The restoration team, aware of the DSIR documents, found themselves reading her notes like scripture. Many said privately that she had seen more in a few steel cuttings than they could in the entire surviving vehicle. Her name still did not appear on any public plaque. But her work, her fingerprints, her insights, her clarity had become inseparable from the tank's recorded history. Every guided tour echoed her conclusions. Every curator used the vocabulary she introduced. Even the casual visitor listening to the explanation of why the Tiger's armor performed inconsistently was unknowingly hearing the voice of a woman whose scientific accuracy had survived where so many wartime legends had not. As the 21st century dawned, the world entered an age where digital retrospectives and high-resolution archival scans allowed historians to revisit the war with forensic precision impossible in earlier decades. New generations of researchers found themselves drawn not to battlefield heroics, but to the intimate material truths hidden in steel and welds and industrial supply lines. More than once, an academic tracing the origins of wartime metallurgy would stumble across her wartime summary sheets, unadorned, methodical, quietly decisive, and realize that they were looking at the foundation of modern materials, science and military engineering. It was around this time that one historian working through newly digitized DSIR files followed a trail of technical memos and metallographic photographs until he arrived at a simple question written in her marginal notes. If the Tiger fails in the microstructure, does the war not fail there as well? That question sparked a research project that became a landmark publication. The author argued that wars should not be studied only through strategy or politics, but through the industrial realities that govern material strength. He dedicated the book not to soldiers or statesmen, but to the unnamed metallurgist who discovered the truth inside Tiger 131. For the first time, her identity surfaced publicly. The revelation did not create headlines. It did not trigger awards or documentaries. But among military engineers, metallurgists, and historians, the news spread quietly, a respectful acknowledgement that a long-forgotten scientist had shaped the trajectory of modern warfare more than many generals whose names fill textbooks. She did not live to see that recognition. She passed away in peaceful obscurity, leaving behind no memoir, no interviews, no public lectures, only notebooks, technical reports, and a legacy encoded in the structure of every modern armored vehicle that prioritized material toughness over brute mass. But her influence endured in ways she could never have imagined. At tank-proving grounds, engineers testing new armor compositions referenced charts built upon her early models. At aerospace facilities, metallurgists studying fatigue limits applied principles she had identified when examining German aircraft alloys. At naval research stations, analysts evaluating submersible hull performance used fracture mapping methods that originated in her wartime lab. Her greatest legacy, however, was philosophical. She had shown the world that the truth behind a machine is not in its silhouette or its reputation, but in the structure of its metal. That the myths surrounding a weapon mean nothing if the steel is flawed. That nations win wars not through the loudest cannons, but through the quiet precision of those who understand how materials behave under pressure. And that sometimes the most decisive blows in history are struck not on battlefields but in laboratories where fragments of enemy armor lie silently under bright lamps. Decades later, a visitor to Bovington might see Tiger 131 and marvel at its size, its menace, its imposing presence. But if that visitor looks closely enough, if they look past the myth, they might notice a faint line in the armor, a subtle fracture preserved from the day the tank was captured, a flaw invisible to most but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. She would have seen it instantly, and she would have understood. If you believe that history is written not only by generals, but by those who decode the truth inside the machines they build, comment the number 7. If you disagree, leave a like. And before you go, subscribe so more forgotten stories like hers can be brought back into the light.